Professor Yann LeCun, Vice President and Chief AI Scientist, Meta. Jacob T. Schwartz Professor, New York University. NUS President, Professor Tan Chai. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the NUS120 Distinguished Speaker Series, Shaping the Future of AI Innovations. I'm Rachel, a final year geography student from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and the Master of Ceremonies for this event. The NUS120 Distinguished Speaker Series brings compelling speakers to share their unique perspectives on pressing issues of the future that affect our country, our region, and the world. The series explores the overarching theme of shaping the future and encourages thought-provoking ideas and conversations that inspire debate and discussion. This morning, we are privileged to have with us Professor Yann LeCun, Vice President and Chief AI Scientist, Meta, and Jacob T. Schwartz Professor, New York University. Moderating the Q&A session with Prof. LeCun will be Prof. Mohan Kankanhali, Provost's Chair Professor of Computer Science, NUS, Director, NUS AI Institute, and Deputy Executive Chairman, AI Singapore. It is now my pleasure to invite NUS President, Professor Tan Chai, to begin by saying a few words. Prof. Tan, please.
Very good Sunday morning to everyone and welcome to the NUS Cambridge campus. I think it's wonderful to see a full house here. We have actually audiences in our overflow rooms, and many are actually joining us over live stream as well. Now, first, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to Professor Yann LeCun, who joins us all the way from New York. We are grateful to Yann for accepting our invitation to the NUS120 Distinguished Speaker Series. Now, our focus today is on the timely topic of AI innovations. We are standing before a very exciting chapter in the story of innovation. In fact, AI has supercharged and also supersized innovation. New ideas, technologies, and applications are emerging at a very much accelerated pace and with unprecedented reach. It is revolutionizing every industry and is present in nearly every aspect of our life. So smart features have already reached a whole new level. Now at NUS, we encourage our students and researchers to experiment and leverage on AI to unpack its potential. We established the NUS AI Institute, which is led by Professor Mohan Kankanhali. Now, this is a university-wide platform, right, where core AI researchers can interact with disciplinary researchers to create interdisciplinary impact. So AI plus X, right, with X being any domain, all right, opens actually many new opportunities to solving really complex problems. And when applied thoughtfully, AI can help resolve some of our biggest challenges, from managing the healthcare needs of Singapore's rapidly aging population, optimizing our urban systems for efficiency, sustainability, and resilience, and many more. So while AI is fascinating and taking the world by storm, the question, however, remains, how will AI continue to innovate? Will AI development reach a bound? Has AI actually achieved human intelligence? Now, this brings to mind a simple yet striking quote by Yann, and I would like to quote, "An elephant or a 4-year-old child is way smarter than any large language model." So in 4 years, a child would have seen 50 times more data than the biggest LLMs today. human intelligence, which is built from our interactions, senses, experiences, definitely goes far beyond text or language. So this morning, we are privileged to have with us Professor Yann LeCun, which is a deep learning specialist at the very forefront of AI development, to speak about this topic. We look forward to gaining insights from Professor Yann LeCun's talk. And I wish everyone a fruitful and also a very productive session. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Tan. I now have the honor to invite on stage our speaker, Professor Yann LeCun. Prof. LeCun, please.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for coming here so numerous on a Sunday morning. I'm not sure to what extent a conference of this type on a Sunday morning would succeed in other countries. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the future of AI, a little bit about the present, because to go towards the future, you have to identify what the limitations of current approaches are so that you can go beyond. I have a nice picture here on the right of a double galaxy. I like to put this picture at the beginning of my talks because I'm proud of it. It's a picture I took from my backyard in New Jersey. It's the M51 galaxy. I have a small telescope. Okay, so what about the future of AI? So what we'd like is, first of all, to switch slide. Okay, this is not working. It was working a few minutes ago, but okay, here we go. So the first thing, you know, a lot of people have been sort of asking the question, do we need to build systems that have, you know, human-like intelligence? And the answer to this is absolutely yes. The purpose is not, there's several purposes. The purpose is not to replace humans, okay, but it's to amplify human intelligence, really. But to amplify human intelligence, you basically have to build virtual humans, more or less. The reason being that the type of entities that we are the most familiar with are other humans. And so we basically need to have systems that can understand the world and understand humans the same way other humans do it, because that would be the simplest thing to do to empower humans. Of course, there is another reason, which is a purely scientific reason. If we discover the mysteries of intelligence and learning, we might understand a lot more about ourselves. So that's a scientific question as much as a technological one, and as much as actually a product need. Okay, so there's a future in which most of our interactions with the digital world and with knowledge will be through the intermediary of AI assistants. We'll get most of our digital diet, or information diet for that matter, from AI systems. And so we need those systems to be, to some extent, smarter than us, so they can assist us in our tasks. And they need to be sort of easy to interact with, because we need the entire world to be able to access it. Okay, so it's, you know, these visions of that future that have been depicted in, you know, science fiction, like this movie Her from 2013. But for Meta, it's also kind of a long-term product vision that all of us would be working around with smart devices in which, you know, smart AI assistants will reside and will basically help us in our daily lives. As a matter of fact, I'm wearing smart glasses right now. And I can talk to the Meta AI assistant. I can ask it any question I want. I'm not going to do this in front of you, but I'm going to take a picture of you. Okay, so you get a smile. Okay. I could have done it by just asking the assistant to take a picture, but it's, easier to just press a button. Okay, so that, oops. Yeah, here we go. So that vision at Meta, there is research in AI to try to make machines sufficiently intelligent to be useful, or more useful, more generally useful. But there's also a hardware component. What is going to be the next computing platform that people will use in the days of AI? And so there's a good chance that the classical interface with the computing world of GUIs and pointing and clicking is going to take a back seat to kind of more natural interfaces through voice and through other types of devices. So Meta has produced demonstration systems like the Orion glasses that some of you might have heard of. So those are glasses a little bigger than the ones I'm wearing now, a little heavier, and they have augmented reality display. The one I'm wearing don't have displays. And have all kinds of capabilities. They basically can watch what you do, and you can ask them, where did I leave my car? I forgot where I put my keys. And when you leave a restaurant and you leave your phone on the table, it tells you you should pick up your phone. You forgot it's on the table. I mean, so it's going to be, our relation to the world is going to change, and it's going to allow us to focus on things that are more properly human, like human-to-human interaction, creativity, and activities of this type. So this is going to be a little bit like every one of us would be walking around with a virtual staff of smart people just working with us. We're all going to feel like, politicians, they can't like walk around without like a staff of people who are all smarter than them, helping them in their daily lives. It's the same thing. We're going to have virtual people who are maybe smarter than you walking around with us at all times. So, okay, there's a major issue with this, which is that current AI technology is just not at the level that we need for this. So I'm saying here, controversially, machine learning sucks. And it's really true in the sense that the capability of current machine learning systems and their ability to learn new tasks is really not at all to the level of what we can observe in humans and animals. And I'm going to go through a few examples of this. So we need AI systems that can learn new tasks very quickly. They need to understand the physical world, not just text and language, but the real world. Have some level of common sense, and certainly abilities to reason and plan, have persistent memory, all the stuff that we expect from intelligent entities. What we need also is that those systems be driven by objectives that we give them. Okay, so it's not the case for most current AI systems. You can't, you can ask an LLM to answer a question, but the LLM may or may not actually answer your question. And there is no way to really give it an objective and have it sort of plan either a sequence of action or an answer to satisfy this or accomplish this objective. So we need a future AI system to be objective-driven. Okay, so some people in the industry, particularly in some information bubble in Silicon Valley, have been claiming LLMs are incredibly powerful, so to reach human intelligence, we just need to scale them up, train them on more data, and eventually they'll reach human-level intelligence. There's even people who have said within 2 years we'll have AI systems that have like PhD-level capabilities in mathematics and other things like that. It's false. And it's false, and it's a mistake that generations after generations of AI scientists have made repeatedly. Even in the 50s, pioneers of AI thought that, intelligence could be reduced to a problem of like searching for a solution. If you can specify a problem and specify whether the problem has been solved or not in the form of a mathematical function, then it's just a matter of searching for a solution within a space of possibilities. And so Newell and Simon in the 50s came up with a program called a general problem solver, very humble, okay, and said, that's it, we can if we can specify a problem in terms of a search, then we have a general program that is just systematically searches through the space of possible solutions and will eventually find one. Now, of course, this was before people realized that most interesting problems scale extremely badly, so they require basically a search to an exponentially growing set of solutions. So that turned out to not be that general. And then the mistake was made again with the first learning machines, the perceptron. People were claiming, now we have machines that can learn, so they're going to become intelligent within 10 years. And again, generations after generations of AI scientists have made that claim. It was false for the last 70 years. It is still false. It's much harder than we think. Okay, so what is an LLM? An LLM is a system that is trained to reproduce its input on its output. Okay, that sounds really strange said this way, but that's really the way it's trained. You take a sequence of words. It's not words, it's tokens, but okay, that's a minor detail. And you train a big neural net to reproduce that sequence on its output. Just basically train it to be the identity function. Okay, that sounds easy. Except that the architecture of the system is such that the system cannot look at one particular input token to compute that output token. It can only look at the tokens that are to the left of it. Okay, this is called a causal architecture. And so implicitly, when you train the system to reproduce its input on its output, you're actually training it to predict the next token from the previous ones. Okay, because of the architecture. So that's called a GPT architecture. Doesn't need to be transformers, doesn't matter. Actually, what it is, the basic idea for this kind of architecture is very, very old. And then once you've trained a system to do this, you can use it to do autoregressive prediction, which is you show it a sequence of words or tokens, and then you ask it to predict the next one. Then you shift that into the input. Okay, so now the system sees the words that you gave it, but also the word that it just produced. And now it can produce a second word, shift that into the input, produce a third, shift that into the input, etc. That's called autoregressive prediction. It's a very old concept from statistics and signal processing, really not new, and filtering. But what's different, of course, is the size of the models that we can train, the fact that we can train them on enormous amounts of data, because we have that now with the internet, and the fact that some property seems to emerge when you do this. Just predicting the next token, turns out that the system has to really kind of understand the underlying meaning to some extent, and is capable of storing a huge amount of information and regurgitating it appropriately. Okay, so it's surprising how powerful this very simple concept is if you scale it up. But that creates a religion of scaling that you just need to scale systems more, and they're going to naturally become more intelligent. I don't think that's true. In fact, I'm quite sure that's not true. I mean, they do become more intelligent if you scale them up, but not to the level that we want them. And in fact, there is a major issue with this idea of autoregressive prediction, which is that every time the system predicts a token, there is some probability that that token takes you outside of the subtree of sequences that would be a good answer for the question you asked. If you assume, which is a big assumption, probably not true, that the probability of error, the errors are independent, okay, as the system produces more token, then inevitably the probability that the system will stay within the subtree of good answers decreases exponentially as you increase the number of tokens. So that requires a lot of assumption, but it's a basic flaw of autoregressive prediction. Basically, if someone asks you to speak without thinking about what you're going to speak next, there's some limit as to how coherent you can be, and that's pretty much the same story. And those things have been studied, in sort of various papers, more or less. Empirically. Okay, so we're missing something big. Some of the other evidence that we're missing something really big is the fact that we have LLMs that can pass the bar exam, for example, or solve complex equations or integrals, or suggest vacation plans or something like this. But first of all, it's mostly regurgitation. So you're not going to have an LLM sort of inventing new solutions to problems that's never been exposed before, which humans are capable of doing, and even a lot of animals can do. And we certainly don't have LLM-based AI systems that understand the physical world. There are systems now that can interpret images and to some extent videos, but the image and video encoding is kind of a separately trained pipeline, if you want. We know how to do computer vision systems. And then we basically turn them into tokens. We turn images into tokens, okay, and treat them like the rest. But the issue with this is that does not produce systems that actually understand the physical world very well. So we don't have domestic robots, right? We don't even have robots that are nearly as good in terms of planning abilities and understanding of the physical world as, let's say, a house cat. We certainly don't have self-driving cars that, like any teenager, can learn to drive in a few hours of practice. Okay? We have gigantic engineering efforts to build self-driving cars, and we have millions of hours of training data of cars being driven by experts. And we still don't have completely reliable self-driving cars unless we cheat, unless we use LiDAR and detailed maps of the entire environment, which is what companies like Waymo are doing. So, clearly we're missing something big. And the question is what? So this is another example of an old problem in AI called the Moravec paradox, which is that why is it that we have computers that can accomplish tasks that are difficult for humans, like playing chess or Go or poker at superhuman level. But then for simple things that we don't even consider as intelligent tasks, like manipulation of objects or planning simple actions, we're nowhere near matching the capabilities of living things. So we're missing something really big there. And the issue is that there is a fundamental difference between language and the physical world. Language, to some extent, is simple. And this is kind of shocking because we think of language as kind of the epitome of human abilities. But in fact, language is relatively simple. So there is this calculation that Professor Chen was just alluding to. And of course, the numbers are evolving because systems are being trained on more data now. But if you take an LLM like Llama 4 or some of the more recent models, they're typically trained on something like 30 trillion tokens, which is basically all the publicly available text on the internet. A token is 3 bytes, so that would be typically 10 to the 14 bytes, roughly. Okay, it would take any of us anywhere between 400,000 and 500,000 years to read through this material. So not possible in a single lifetime. Okay, then compare this with the amount of information that gets to a visual cortex in the context of just a few years. A young child, a 4-year-old child, has been awake a total of 16,000 hours, and the amount of information that gets to our visual cortex or through our sensory cortex through touch is about 2 megabytes per second. We have 2 million optic nerve fibers coming from the eyes to the brain. Each carries about 1 byte per second, roughly. And then you do the arithmetics, and you get to about 10 to the 14 bytes. So the amount of information getting to the visual cortex in 4 years in a child is about the same as the amount of information digested by the biggest LLMs of today. So that tells you a number of things. It tells you we're never going to get to human-level AI by training an LLM on text. It's just never going to happen. We have to be able to train systems from high-bandwidth sensory inputs like video or other modalities. And the bad news is that the current architectures that we're using that work really well for text do not work for video. And so maybe we can get some inspiration of how young children learn. And when I say young children, it's not just human children, it's also animals. Animals go through a similar process of learning how the world works in the first few hours, days, weeks, months of life. So it takes human babies a few months to learn very basic things about the world, like, basically the world is three-dimensional. The fact that, there are objects that can sort of independently move in the world, and if you don't see an object because it's hidden behind another one, it still exists. That's called object permanence. It's not something we were born with. We learned this in the first 2 months, maybe. It's very hard to actually measure in humans. You can measure in animals. It's a little easier to measure whether they actually know about object permanence, and it depends on the species. But then there are things like, even children who don't speak yet know about like basic categories of objects. Like dogs and cats do that too. They know about certain categories of objects spontaneously. They don't need to give a name to them. And then to learn basic concepts about intuitive physics, the fact that objects that are not supported fall because of gravity, that takes 9 months in humans. It's a lot faster in most animal species, but it's 9 months in humans. So you show the scenario at the bottom here of a little car sitting on a platform, and then you push that little car off the platform, and it appears to float in the air. A 6-month-old baby will not be surprised. A 10-month-old will be extremely surprised, because the 10-month-old has learned that objects are supposed to fall. And so the 10-month-old will probably look like the little girl. And that's actually how psychologists measure whether a particular property of the world has been learned by an infant, is by measuring the degree of surprise, which is how long the child stares at the situation. So how do we get machines to learn like babies? And in fact, that sort of perhaps suggests a list of desiderata for future AI systems. What should they be capable of? They should really learn mental models of the world the way we do it, from observation, possibly also from interaction, obviously, and learn intuitive physics and things like this. Like, how can we predict what's going to happen in the world? How do we learn mental models that allow us to do this? Systems that have persistent memory, systems that can plan complex action sequences so as to fulfill a particular objective, and the systems that can reason, and reasoning and planning are really the same thing, and basically invent new solutions to unseen problems without being trained to solve them. So we call that like zero shot. We're capable of doing this. A lot of animals are capable of doing this, handling new situations they haven't been trained to handle, and using their power of reasoning and planning and their mental world model. We don't have AI systems that are capable of doing this today. And then lastly, systems that are controllable and safe by design. Basically, what they can do is only fulfill the objectives that we give them and not anything else. And again, that's not the case of LLMs today. So I'm going to go through a bunch of characteristics that I think AI systems should have if we want them to fulfill those conditions. So the first thing is, what type of inference should they be able to do? So inference is the process by which the system computes an output. Right? It's not the learning process. We assume the system is trained. How is it computing the output it wants to produce? Okay, there's one model, which is popularized by neural nets, but others as well, where the way the system computes an output is by, you feed an input to it, and you propagate the signal through a bunch of layers of some neural net, and then it produces an output, and that's the answer. Okay? LLMs work this way. You feed a prompt, and you run through the bunch of layers of your transformer, and it's going to produce one token. The amount of computation that goes into the computation of a single token is fixed. Okay? And that kind of limits the complexity of the type of computation that is taking place. There's a fixed amount of computation per token. Now, of course, in LLMs, you can sort of modulate this a little bit by basically enticing the LLM to produce more tokens, so the system devotes more computation to a complex question. That's called chain of thoughts. But it's kind of a hack. And it's not really a way to handle reasoning in a true sense. A better way to perform inference is through optimization. Okay, so now your model is not a neural net that you propagate through. It's a complex machine. It might involve neural nets and multi-layer systems. But really what it does is that it computes a scalar value, a single number, that's the output. And that number measures to what extent the input and a proposed output are compatible or incompatible, okay? So let's say you show the image of an elephant and the proposed output is the label that represents elephant. The system will produce a low output, let's say 0. And if the category you propose is something else, like say, I don't know, table, the system will give you a large number, okay? That's called energy-based model. So basically a system that measures the degree of incompatibility between an input and a proposed output. So the inference process now consists in searching through a space of outputs for one that minimizes that energy, okay? It's an intrinsically more powerful inference process because any computational problem can be reduced to an optimization problem of this type, but not every computational problem can be reduced to propagation through a fixed number of layers in the neural net. Okay, so it's intrinsically more powerful. So that's something that AI systems need to implement, inference by optimization. And in fact, this is not a new concept at all. I was referring to Newell and Simon, but also like classical AI is all about search for solution in a solution space. Probabilistic inference in graphical models is all about optimization. It's searching for the value of a set of variables whose value you don't know that is most compatible to a set of variables that you do know according to some likelihood function, okay, which you can think of as an energy, a negative energy. There is, you know, a lot of problems in computer science, like in motion planning for robots, is based on this idea that you search for a sequence of controls that will make the robot achieve the task that you want, grab an object or something. So that's a very common concept, but we've forgotten about this a little bit in the context of sort of modern AI. So this type of, you know, deliberately kind of searching for an answer in the context of human cognition is called system 2. So we have two ways of kind of acting. Human behavior can be seen as sort of there's sort of two modes, if you want. There's a mode where you accomplish a task that you're very familiar with. You don't have to think about it. It's kind of subconscious, and you can accomplish it without actually being conscious of it. Okay. So if you're an experienced driver, you can drive without really thinking about it. You can do something else at the same time. You can talk to someone. You can listen to the radio or whatever. It's become automatic. Okay. But the first few hours you were driving, you were paying complete attention to the situation and basically using all the power of your mind to figure out what to do. And it's really true in most situations that we are in every day. Most professions that many of us here are in or are planning to be in, if you're a student, you know, require our conscious mind and deliberate reasoning at all times. So this is called system 2. It's slower. It requires more energy, mental energy, but also actual energy. But it's more powerful. We can solve new problems, find new solutions to things we've never encountered before. LLMs are incapable of doing this at the moment, or they can do it in very, very restricted ways. So this suggests kind of a framework to explain how those systems work, called energy-based models. If you want to model the dependency between two variables, let's say x and y, which in this little diagram here are scalar, but they could be as complex as you want. They can be discrete or continuous. So x is an observation, y is maybe a space of proposed outputs, and the dependency between two variables can be represented by an energy function that takes low values where pairs of x and y are compatible, and then larger values where pairs of x and y are not compatible. And this is more powerful than representing a function that computes y from x. You can think of this as an implicit function that captures the dependency between x and y. But the advantage of this is that you may have multiple y's that are compatible with a single x, for the same reason that you can have multiple actions that will accomplish a particular task, okay? If you have a system that just computes a single action, it's not nearly as powerful as a system that will tell you whether a particular proposed action is compatible with, will accomplish the task that you want. Because you might have multiple ways of solving that task, multiple answers that are, compatible with the input. So think about, the black dot here as representing training data, and then the lines with different colors representing different level sets of the energy function. Okay, so how are we going to use this energy function that measures the compatibility between input and output in the context of a sort of an intelligent system, if you want? It's going to have to be an architecture perhaps of this type, which is built around the concept of a world model. What is a world model? A world model is something that, given the current state of the world, and perhaps given a proposed action that you imagine taking, the world model predicts what the resulting state of the world is going to be. Okay? Right? So given the state of the world and an action you imagine taking, can you predict the next state of the world? So if I take this object and I tell you I'm going to open my hand, you can readily predict the object is going to fall. And this mental prediction, mental ability, conditioned on action, is what allows us to plan. It's also what allows us to reason. Okay? Because we can imagine the outcome of taking a sequence of actions. And what that means is that now we can, by search, we can figure out a sequence of actions to arrive at a particular outcome. Okay? That's how we plan. In fact, this concept is very old in the context of robotics and optimal control, going back to the 1960s. The fact that you have a model of the system you want to control, and by optimization, you can figure out a sequence of commands that will cause the system to reach a particular goal. This is how, space agencies around the world have computed trajectories of rocket to rendezvous with a space station or go into orbit. It's a very old set of techniques. But generally, the model is built by hand by engineers and scientists. Here, what we're talking about is learning a model from observation and perhaps interaction. Okay, so we have several components here. We have, we observe the current situation. It goes into a perception module that essentially estimates a representation for the current state of the world. It's not going to represent all the details about the current situation of the world, but like the relevant ones that might be relevant for any task. We may not be able to perceive the entire state of the world at the moment, so we need to combine this with the content of a memory that basically contains our idea of the state of the world that we do not currently perceive. Okay, so we all know how to get out of this building because we came through the door, so we have somewhere in our memory the location of the door and how we have to walk out of this room to get to the door. That's stored in our memory. And then all the rest that we know about the world is in our memory. So we combine the content of this memory with the current perception, and we feed this to our world model. And then we feed a hypothesis for an action that we might take to the world model. And what the world model does is predict what's going to happen next. What is going to be the next state of the world? Now, what we can do is feed that predicted state to a bunch of objective functions represented by the red squares or rectangles. And what those are implicit functions that produce an energy, a scalar output. And there's an implicit idea that the various terms are summed up. Okay, so the overall energy is the sum of the outputs of all of those red rectangles. One of them, the task objective, measures to what extent the task has been accomplished. Okay, so it takes value 0, let's say, if the task was accomplished, and then larger values if the task was not accomplished. And then there may be a set of guardrail objectives. So those guardrails could be either cost functions, or they could be also constraints. So now the problem becomes an optimization under constraints that guarantee that, whatever sequence of state of the world that the system will cause will not hurt anyone, for example. Will be safe, will, be within some limit. Okay, so now what the system does at any kind of episode is that it searches, by optimization, it searches for a sequence of actions that optimize those objectives or satisfies the constraints according to the prediction of its world model. Okay, that's the way it operates. So inference by optimization, and that is a way to do planning and reasoning. And this architecture is a way to build an intelligent system if we figure out how to do it. Now, a world model generally is applicable. Okay, something I want to say before that. This idea that somehow you can predict the result of an intervention is also crucial to the process of science. Okay, when we build a model in science, we have some abstract representation of the state of the world, like the relevant variable of a physical system, for example. And then the model that we have is maybe a set of equations, but it may be more complicated than that. And then we imagine an experiment, which is basically an action that we take or perturbation intervention that we operate on the system. And then our model supposedly is able to predict the outcome. And perhaps by optimization, we can design an intervention that will produce a particular result, okay? So this is really very much what we do in science. This is not just an AI problem. It's kind of a model of really how we think, and how we come up with sort of new ideas about the world. A very conceptual model at this point. And we can sort of verify whether a hypothesis is true or not using this kind of experiment. Now, if we have a world model that can predict the next state of the world given an action, we can use it repeatedly over time and imagine the outcome not just of a single action, but maybe a whole sequence of actions by applying the world model recursively, autoregressively. Okay, so we can run a world model for multiple steps, feed that to the guardrail cost, and then somehow come up with some optimization algorithm that will figure out the sequence of actions to optimize our actions. Since all of those modules presumably will be neural nets, they will be differentiable, and we can use gradient-based methods perhaps to do the planning. But perhaps we may have to use more sophisticated methods as well. Now, really the world is not entirely deterministic, so it might be difficult to actually plan a sequence of action where there's a lot of unknowns about the world. And so the way you handle unknowns is that you can make a neural net, which is a deterministic function. You can turn it into a non-deterministic function by feeding it an extra input variable that you draw from a distribution. It's called a latent variable. Okay, it's a much better way of expressing kind of probabilistic prediction than to write, P of y given x. It's really a deterministic function you're computing, but because it has a latent variable as an argument, it becomes now stochastic. And of course, those latent variables could vary over multiple sets, and so the problem of planning in the presence of uncertainty might be a little complicated, but the basic mechanism is really not different from what I described earlier. Now, if we really want to build a truly intelligent system, we have to enable it to do planning like most animals, and certainly like humans, which is hierarchical planning. So if I'm planning to, let's say I'm sitting in my office in New York, at NYU, and I want to go to Paris, okay? And it's the middle of the day. I know that I can get to Paris the next morning, but what I need to do is first go to the airport and catch a plane. Go to the airport before the flight leaves in the evening and catch a plane, okay? So I cannot plan my entire trip to Paris in terms of elementary actions, which in the case of humans would be basically millisecond by millisecond muscle controls. Okay, I cannot do this because I don't have the information. Also, it would be an incredibly complicated planning problem. Okay, so we don't plan at a single level. We plan hierarchically. We have a goal, going to Paris. That's like an objective. Okay, we decompose it into sub-goals. The first sub-goal is getting to the airport. Now I have a sub-goal. How do I get to the airport? Okay, I can go down one level in the hierarchy of representation, and then put a bit more detail about the first part. Well, I need to go down in the street and hail a taxi. You can do this in New York. Okay, now I have another sub-goal, going on the street. Well, I have to go to the elevator, push the button, and take the elevator down and walk out the building. How do I get to the elevator? I have to stand up from my chair, pick up my bag, open my door, close it behind me, walk while avoiding all the obstacles, which I may not be able to plan in advance because I don't know where all the obstacles will be. There'll be people running around. Okay, so how do I stand up from my chair? Now you get to a level where description in terms of language is basically impossible. We cannot go down below a certain level and describe things in language. Language becomes completely inappropriate, insufficient for below a certain level of abstraction. So what that tells you is, again, we're not going to do this with LLMs. We're going to have systems that are capable of understanding the physical world, but also plan low-level actions and do so hierarchically. This problem of hierarchical planning is completely unsolved. Okay, it's a major challenge, I believe, in AI. Few people are working on it with sort of machine learning type approaches. If you're starting a PhD or about to start a PhD or a new faculty wondering what should I work on and have an impact in AI, solve this problem. Okay? If you have some good idea about it, I hire you within a minute. And Pascal Fong, who is sitting right here, is also hiring you within a minute. She has the same problem. We both work at FAIR. She's in Paris, I'm in New York. So it's a major problem. So I wrote a paper 3 years ago that I put online. I mean, this is sort of a distillation of a lot of ideas I've been working on for many years of where I think AI research should go over the next decade. And that paper is 3 years old, which means it was published before the LLM craze. It hasn't changed. Okay, LLMs haven't really changed the basic premise of this paper. The title is A Path Towards Autonomous Machine Intelligence. It's not on archive, it's an open review, so you can make comments on it. And we now changed the name. I changed the word autonomous to advanced because autonomous scares people. And so we had this program at FAIR and also at my lab at NYU that we call Advanced Machine Intelligence, AMI. Okay, we actually pronounce it AMI, which means friend in French. And this is the word that we use instead of AGI. Most other people would call this AGI, okay? I don't like the term because the concept of AGI is machines that have the same level of intelligence as humans, but human intelligence is actually very specialized. And so calling it general intelligence is complete nonsense. So AMI, AMI. And these various talks I've given about this over the last few years, you get to see the latest one. And it's got some new results that I haven't talked about yet. Okay, so in that paper I described sort of a general architecture similar to the one I just described, but also with a little more components and a little more details about how this might be built. And it's called a cognitive architecture, built around this idea of a world model. And this idea of world model is really sort of getting a lot of traction in the AI research community now, at least from the people who don't believe that you're going to be able to just get to human level AI by just scaling up LLMs. Okay, but the big question we have to ask ourselves now is how could machines learn world models from observation or from design architectures that basically from which world models would emerge? And for scientists or physicists, it's kind of an analogy is how do scientists elaborate models of the phenomena that they observe? And the concept for this is self-supervised learning. So self-supervised learning is the sort of general framework of training a system to capture the dependencies between the input. You give it an input which is not like a single input, but maybe a sequence or maybe multiple parts of an input, and you basically train the system to tell you whether that set of input is consistent, coherent, or whether some parts of it are really not compatible with the rest. And so LLMs are a special case of this, and a sort of general view, if you want, of the process I described earlier for training LLMs is perhaps one in which you take, let's say, a sequence of words or tokens, and you corrupt it in some way. Remove some of the words, for example, or change them. And then you train a big neural net to recover the pieces that are missing, the words that are missing. Okay, and this works really well. So LLMs are based on this principle. As I said, they use this causal architecture to basically not have to do explicit masking, but it's an implicit masking in the architecture, essentially, where a system cannot have access to the present and the future. It can only use the past to predict the present. And of course, there's a very old idea that comes from neuroscience from many years ago, decades, in fact, that if you were able to train a system to predict what's going to happen in a video, this system will have understood the structure of reality. Right? If you can predict what's going to happen in a video, particularly in the long term, that means you have really captured the nature of reality. So why don't we do the same thing for video? Take a video, turn it into tokens or whatever, right? And then train a big neural net to predict what's going to happen next in the video. In some form, I've worked on this problem for 15 to 20 years. Some of my colleagues at FAIR have been working on this for the last 10 years. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because predicting all the details of what happens in a video is just too hard. It's impossible, essentially. And here are some examples. So if you train a neural net on very short videos, just 6 frames, you give it 4 frames and you ask it to predict the next 2 frames. You get the kind of predictions that you see at the top. There's 4 frames and then the last 2 are predicted and they're blurry. Why are they blurry? Because the neural net doesn't know what's going to happen, and so it predicts the average of all the plausible futures. And that's a blurry image. And if you apply this to another situation, like predicting the trajectory of cars on the highway, you get those blurry predictions that you see on the second column from the left in the panel below. So those are like very simple, simplistic sort of schematic videos, and you get those kind of blurry predictions because the system cannot predict if a car is going to accelerate or brake or turn or not and change lane or whatever. So it predicts an average. So of course, a natural tendency is to do, well, okay, I'm going to do like with text. I'm not going to predict a single prediction. I'm going to make a probabilistic prediction, predict a distribution of all possible outcomes. You can do this with text because with text, you can never exactly predict the word that comes after a sequence, but you can produce a distribution, a probability distribution over all the possible words or tokens in your dictionary. Okay, we call this softmax in machine learning. But you can't do this for video. We don't have a way of usefully representing distributions in the space of all possible video frames. So people have been sort of struggling with this problem for years. And there's been some progress, in things like GANs and more recently diffusion models and flow models and stuff like that, which kind of are an attempt at basically weakly representing distributions in high-dimensional continuous spaces. But still, it's not only sufficient, it's basically solving a more complex problem that you need. So my solution to this is do not attempt to predict all the details in the video. Predict an abstract representation of the video. Okay, so let me take an example. If I take this object and I hold it with my finger in this direction, and I tell you I'm going to lift my finger, you know that the object is going to fall, right? Because it's kind of a rounded tip. You can't predict in which direction. You probably don't have enough information. You don't know how I'm going to lift exactly my finger. So there is an abstract representation level where you can tell the object is going to fall, but you can't predict every pixel because you don't know in which direction it's going to fall. Let me take another example. If I take a video of this room, okay, and I'll start from here, and I slowly pan, and I stop, and then I ask the system, just continue that video. System is going to figure out we're in a conference room, and there's people sitting, and the conference room probably has a finite size, and the right side probably looks like the left side. It can predict some information about it, but there's absolutely no way it can predict what every one of you looks like. It's just not enough information. So if we train a system to make this kind of prediction at a very fine level, there's no way it can work. It's going to spend all of its resources attempting to predict things that it just cannot predict. And that's a complete waste. In fact, it causes the system to not learn much. And we have a lot of empirical evidence that this is the case. When we train, for example, if you want to train a system to learn representations of images, and you train it to, for example, you take an image, you corrupt it, and you train it to reconstruct the image from the corrupted version, and you hope that the internal representation learned by the system would be a good representation of the image. It doesn't work very well. Here is what works well. What works well is called joint embedding architectures, or more precisely, joint embedding predictive architectures, JEPA, okay? And the idea is the following. You take the original video or input, whatever it is, you corrupt it or transform it in some way, mask the future, for example, or the second half, okay? And instead of training a system to reconstruct the entire video, you run the video through an encoder, okay? You get a representation of a full video, let's call it SY, and a representation of the partially masked or corrupted or transformed video, let's call it SX. And then you train the system to predict SY from SX. So you still train the system to make predictions, but not in pixel space, in representation space. Okay? And again, this is a process that, as intelligent beings, we do all the time, finding an appropriate representation of the world that allows us to make predictions. And this is what we do all the time in science. The whole purpose of science is what are the relevant variables of the state of a system, for example, in physics, that will allow me to make predictions as to how the system will evolve. You know, I can dump on you all the information we've ever collected about the planet Jupiter. But then if I ask you, can you predict where Jupiter is going to be 100 years from now? You only need 6 numbers. You need 3 positions and 3 velocities, and you're done. You don't need to know how big Jupiter is, as long as it's small enough compared to the sun. You don't need to know how many moons it has, what temperature it is, what density, none of that. So this idea of learning representations so as to make prediction is really fundamental, I think, to science, but also, I think, fundamental to AI. And we're not going to get there with generative models. So what you see on the left is a generative model that tries to predict the input. And what you see on the right is one of those joint embedding predictive architecture, JEPA, which does not attempt to make prediction at the input level, but attempts to learn an abstract representation within which predictions can be made. I think it's fundamentally different. I think it's really important to work on this, and there is specific problems that appear when you try to train an architecture of this type. It's much easier to train a generative architecture, but it's impossible to make it work for video. Okay, so we have to abandon generative AI. Okay, that sounds shocking. When I say this to my colleagues in the meta organization called Gen AI, they're not particularly happy about me. Okay, and within the wider community, which is completely obsessed with generative AI today, when I say within a few years we're going to have to abandon the whole idea of generative AI, they think I'm crazy. But I'm used to that, so it's happened before. So that's a big recommendation. And again, this is how models are built in physics or in science more generally. And the reason why we need to lift the abstraction level when we try to make predictions is because that's the way we can apprehend the world. There's a famous quote from Albert Einstein, which is the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that the world is comprehensible. Right? I mean, how is it that there is structure in the world that allows us to survive and understand the world? And the reason we can do this is because we can build those levels of abstraction, okay? In principle, we could model everything that is currently taking place in this room in terms of quantum field theory, right? We can derive everything that happens in a physical system through quantum field theory or whatever the current theory is about physics. But of course, it would be completely impractical. So we've invented, multiple levels of abstractions to allow us to make prediction at different levels. And, from quantum field to particles to atoms and molecules and materials and objects and machines. And in the living world, it's proteins, organelles, cells, organisms, individuals, societies, right? And we never describe, looking for an appropriate level of representation is really, and a good representation at one level is a very important question. It's all about learning representations. The conference that I started 12 years ago, which is taking place this week in Singapore, ending today, is called International Conference on Learning Representations. That's really the crucial central problem in AI, I think, and it's been for a long time. That's the whole purpose of deep learning, really. So here we go. These are so different flavors of joint embedding architectures, but let me accelerate a little bit. So what we need to do is train those architectures. And the main issue that we have to solve is to prevent them from collapsing. So if we just train them to minimize the prediction error in the representation space, so the difference between SY and the predicted SY, and we don't do anything else, the system will simply choose to ignore all the information about the input and then produce constant output, so SY and SX would be equal, and now the prediction problem becomes trivial. And the system will give zero energy to everything we present it. That's not a good model. We need the system to give zero energy to pairs of X and Y that we show it, but we also need it to produce higher energy for things that we don't show it. Okay, that's where it becomes complicated. That's where we need the framework of energy-based models, which I showed before. So how do we make sure that for things that we don't show the system, the energy is actually higher than for examples that we show? And there's two classes of methods, one set called contrastive methods, and another set called regularized method that I call regularized method. The basic idea of contrastive methods is that you generate contrastive points that are pairs of X and Y that are not present in a training set. And you change the parameters of your model so that their energy goes up. Okay, so you push down the energy of the training samples, compatible pairs of X and Y, and you push up the energy of those contrastive samples. Unfortunately, that's not very scalable because if you have a high-dimensional representation space, you need a number of contrastive points that, in the limit, needs to grow exponentially with the dimension of that representation space. Whereas regularized methods work differently. They have a term in the cost function that you minimize during training that tries to minimize the volume of space that can take low energy. So that, may be more efficient. And it's a little mysterious how you do this. You can turn energy-based models into parametric model, but let me skip this. And so some experiments that people have done over the last 10 years or so is pre-train a system architecture that you want, let's say with images, and train it to produce representations and then test whether those representations are good representation by training a head on top of it using supervised learning and seeing whether the performance on the supervised task is good. Okay, so if the representation that is learned is good, then with a small head, maybe 1 or 2 layers, you might be able to get good performance for object classification or some other vision task, right? So that's the scenario. And you can use contrastive method, which consists in presenting pairs to the system that are basically the different views of the same image, but simultaneously presenting pairs that are different and then pushing their representations away from each other. That concept was invented many years ago in 1993 in one of my papers, but it doesn't work for high-dimensional representations, unfortunately. So another set of methods are called distillation methods, and the way those works is that you have the two encoders, and the two encoders share the same weights, but in a funny way. The encoder on the right uses an exponential moving average of the weights of the encoder on the left. And only the encoder on the left gets gradients. The gradients are not backpropagated to the one on the right. Okay, they just get basically a time average of the weights of the one on the left. So these are called distillation methods, and with EMA, exponential moving average. And this works, but it's very mysterious why. It doesn't collapse for some reason, at least in some conditions. And there's some theory on this, one of those papers here by some our colleagues at FAIR in California, as well as Surya Ganguly from Stanford. But it's only in kind of a restricted case, so from the theoretical point of view, this is not well understood why it works. But it does work, and there's a number of methods that we've used. So there's a technique called Dino, which is developed by our colleagues at FAIR in Paris, and it's all open source. You can just download it and use it, and it's basically a completely general way of extracting representation features for images that you can use for all kinds of stuff. So we have people who have used it to estimate the height of the canopy of the, around the world, which gives us an estimate of how much carbon is captured in vegetation. We have people who use this for medical images, for biology, for all kinds of things. Some more recent work is a paper that popped up on arXiv just a couple of weeks ago, where we show that this Dino method, which is completely self-supervised, can actually produce representations that are better in absolute term than anything that is supervised that people have produced so far. Okay, clip style, for example. And this is very important because until now that wasn't the case. People believed that supervised learning was always going to beat self-supervised learning. It's not the case anymore. Here's an example of how you can use this. So this is a world model of the type that I described before that is used for planning. For example, planning actions of a robot, and it uses the representation trained through this Dino algorithm, which I didn't go into the details of how it's done, but it's completely self-supervised, no labeled data whatsoever. So you show, the way you train the world model is that you show the system a situation like this robot arm with a bunch of little blue chips on a platter or something like that. You get this robot to accomplish an action, very simple one, like move on the table, translate by delta x delta y, and lift. And then you observe the result, and you train a neural net to predict the representation of the result from the representation of the initial state and the action you took. Once you have that system, you can enroll it in time. Okay, so observe the current situation of the world, run it through the Dino representation extractor, and then imagine a sequence of actions. Imagine the result of taking those actions by running the world model multiple time steps, and plug this into a distance measure, that measures the distance between a target state and the predicted state. Okay? Now the inference process consists in searching by optimization for a sequence of actions that minimizes that distance at inference time. Okay? All kinds of people talk about test time computation. This is test time computation. But it's inference, right, by optimization. In an abstract representation space of actions, actually. And if you do this, it actually works, and you can train a decoder to sort of represent what the system thinks its predictions are going to be. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to explain this particular chart, but I'm going to show you a video. I'm not going to bore you with details of like how better this works than alternative approaches that people have proposed in the past, like Dreamer and things like that. So let me show the actual final video. Okay, so you start from this initial state, and here is a collection of target states. And then using planning, using this model, at the bottom what you see is the sequence of actions that have been planned by the system to arrive at a configuration which is as close as possible to the target at the top. Okay, and the sequence of actions being taken here is on the order of 25. It kind of works. The dynamics of those blue chips is really, really complicated because they interact with each other, they push each other. Like if you were to sort of do this in the classical optimal control sense, it would basically be impossible. So, and we applied this to a number of different situations. So this works really well. It's open sourced. There's a website with demos. There's another more recent work with, this is actually older work, where we use this JEPA type architecture with a slightly different way to train it It's called IJPA and VJPA, and it consists in training a system to represent images or video using this JPA architecture, using masks. So take an image or a video, mask it partially, and then train an encoder to represent this image or this video in such a way that you can predict the representation of the full video from the representation of the corrupted or partially masked video. And this works really well. It's very efficient, it learns fast, it works better than all the methods that people have tried that are generative. So the black square dots here is a method that is trained self-supervised by reconstruction. You take an image, you mask certain portions of it, and then you train some big neural net, an autoencoder essentially, to reconstruct the full image. And what you see here is, how many hours you spend training the system. And on the y-axis is the performance on object classification, where you train a head on top of the representation for classifying objects. And what you see is the blue curve, which is this IJPA method, gets better performance faster than the masked autoencoder technique, which works by reconstruction. So the idea that we're going to be able to train systems to learn representations of the world by reconstruction, meaning by generative models, is probably wrong. Okay, you're better off using those joint embedding architectures. We have lots of evidence in the context of image and video that not reconstructing works much better than reconstructing. So again, forget about generative models. I mean, unless you want to generate text, unless you want to generate video. But if you're interested in understanding the content, do not generate. Or generate in representation space. So this similar experiment for video, where we give a short video of 16 frames to the system, train it to reconstruct the partially masked video. And again, you can test whether the representation can be used to classify actions or predict actions or things like this, or even to plan actions for a robot. I don't have examples of this here, and I'm not going to bore you with details, but it works really well. And then you can train a separate decoder and see, kind of what the system sort of imagine would happen in the part of the video that is masked. And something very surprising is that now you can use that system in the same situation that a psychologist would test the abilities of an infant. And so you show it a video where something impossible happens, like a ball is being thrown in the air, and the ball follows a trajectory and then disappears. Okay, or the ball follows a trajectory and then turns into a cube. Or the ball disappears behind the screen, and then the screen comes down and the ball is not there anymore. Okay, so something that's physically impossible. So you show those videos to the system, and you measure its prediction error in the representation space. Every single time, the system will have a high prediction error for whenever there's an impossible event that occurs. And so those systems basically have learned a bit of common sense, of what is possible in the real world and what is not, by just being trained on natural video, which is really the first time this happened, and I think it's pretty cool. And again, there's a lot of results on this. I encourage you to read the paper. Now, we're looking for a better method to train those JPA architectures that are based on some maximization of information measure. And I don't really have time to explain exactly how this works, but you basically train the system. So it's one of those non-contrastive and non-distillation method that attempts to have some estimate of the information that comes out of the encoder and tries to maximize the information that comes out of the encoder using, for example, a covariance measure of some kind. And this works. So there's a particular technique there, and it works, and it's not theoretically well justified either, because we want to maximize information content, which means that we would need a lower bound on information content that we push up. And unfortunately, we don't have lower bounds on information content, we only have upper bounds. And so we maximize an upper bound, and we cross our fingers that the actual information content follows. But really, we cannot be sure. It just works. So these methods are based on basically making sure that individual variables coming out of the encoder are not collapsed. They don't have zero variance. So we maintain the variance level above a certain threshold. And then we also make sure they are uncorrelated. Okay. So basically making sure that if you have a bunch of samples that you show the system, and over a batch of sample, what you want is the column of that matrix of representations are as orthogonal as possible and as close to norm 1 as possible. Okay? Then there is contrastive methods. The contrastive methods do the same thing, but for the rows of that matrix. They try to make every sample have a different representation. Okay, so there's a duality between those two methods, which I'm not going into the details of. There is a paper that describes this duality here. It's interesting. There is some theory on this, which I'm not going to go into, and various tricks to make it work efficiently, which I'm not going to go into, and some results, which I'm not going to go into. But we can train world models with this technique, and world models that basically you can use for planning. So we train them using this variance-covariance loss, this covariance matrix loss, and we train a world model to make multi-step predictions, and then we can use this to plan a sequence of actions for simple situations like planning a trajectory in a maze to reach a particular goal. This is supposed to be a video. We can even apply this to kind of scientific situations to predict the properties of partial differential equations, but I'm going to skip this because I'm running out of time, and I want to go to the conclusion. Another example, so this is from natural video where we trained a world model here using a pre-trained encoder to predict what the world is going to look like when you move. So you are a robot and you move the robot. Can you predict at the representation level what the world is going to look like once the robot has moved? If you can predict this, then you can tell the robot, like, go to the blue trash can. And it might be far away from the trash can, but because it can predict what the world is going to look like when it's near the trash can, it can basically predict a course of actions to get there. This is a new paper. It's on arXiv. There's a demo site as well. And OK, so basically, here are the recommendations that I'm having, OK, that are making me extremely popular in the AI field. Abandon generative models in favor of those JEPA. Abandon probabilistic models because now you're making prediction in an abstract representation space where probability distributions don't make sense because they're not based on data. OK, so you're not going to be able to make probabilistic arguments about it. You're going to have to use these energy-based models, which is kind of a weaker form of a weaker framework. Abandon contrastive methods in favor of those either distillation or regularization method that I just alluded to in the last part of the talk. And of course, as I've been saying for 12 years now, minimize the use of reinforcement learning because reinforcement learning is extremely inefficient. And so you need to have a lot of background knowledge about the world before you can use reinforcement learning to sort of fine-tune your behavior. And it's necessary, but you should minimize its use because it requires too many trials. If we were forced to use reinforcement learning to train ourselves to drive, there would be a lot of dead people on the roads. And so the conclusion of this is that if you are really interested in sort of reaching human-level AI, like getting to the next step in AI, which you should if you are in academic environment, you should not work on LLMs. Okay? If you want to work on LLMs, work on LLM. If you are interested in generating text or you do NLP, okay. But if you're really interested in sort of long-term objective of AI, which is building intelligent machines, LLMs are a distraction. They're an off-ramp. Okay? They're useful. There's a lot of jobs there. There's a lot of cool things you can do in that context. So I'm not saying you should not, if that's what you're interested in. But if you are interested in making progress in AI, significant progress, forget about LLMs. Now, there's a lot of problems to solve there, which I've kind of swept under the rug. And, planning with latent variables, scaling up world models to be large scale for all kinds of modalities, planning in the presence of uncertainty, hierarchical planning, as I said, is completely unsolved. And then different associative memory, which I haven't talked about. And all kinds of technical issues that are linked with this, which maybe if you are a mathematician or something might be interesting to you. And what we might be able to do in the future, maybe within 3, 5, 10 years, is get to the next step in AI, systems that can reason, that can plan, that understand the physical world, all things that really LLMs are incapable of doing. And that will open the door to robots that are smart enough to be useful. Okay, there's a big secret now in the industry, which is a lot of people are building robots, humanoid robots. There's a lot of companies being formed to do this. Nobody has any idea how to make those robots smart enough to be useful. It's true. The technology does not exist. You can make them useful for very narrow tasks, but that's not what you want. Ultimately, you want them to be as versatile as humans, and nobody has any idea how to do this. So basically, what some of those companies are counting on is that AI is going to make sufficient progress over the next 3 to 5 years so that by the time that their robots are kind of, the hardware is commercially viable, AI will have made sufficient progress to actually make them useful. But the idea somehow that this technology exists and that those robots can be made useful today is just false. So another thing which I've been very adamant about is the necessity of open source platforms for, first of all, enabling academics to contribute to the issue, because training foundation models is very expensive and you can't do this in academia at the moment. And so open source platforms are necessary for that. They're also necessary for all kinds of reasons that have to do with sovereignty and cultural diversity and linguistic diversity. But maybe we'll talk about this during the question. Thank you very much. And I apologize for taking longer than expected. But I hope we have some time for the Q&A.
Thank you, Prof. LeCun. May we now invite you, as well as Prof. Mohan, to take your seats on stage for the question and answer session. The floor is now yours, Prof. Mohan.
Thank you, Yann, for that most irreverent and most inspiring talk. A round of applause, please, once again. So first of all, I really want to thank you for actually holding on to irreverent ideas for a long time. CNN with backpropagation, self-supervised learning, and also open source. And that has partially led to the excitement in AI today. So thank you very much for all your contribution. But I was a little bit, worried. Are LLMs totally useless? Where do you think LLMs are most useful?
I mean, LLMs are incredibly useful.
Yeah.
I'm sure many of us here in the room are using them for various things. No, they're really, really useful, and they should be pushed as an industry, as a product, and they're going to make progress in their reliability, in their ability to handle multiple languages, solving various problems, etc. For code, it's incredibly useful for code. It really improves the productivity of people. You don't have to go through pages of a documentation to figure out, how to call this particular API. You just, call your coding assistant, and it's going to give you a piece of code. So yeah, no, they are useful, but like every piece of computer technology in the past, it's not because they are useful that they are a solution to human-level AI, okay? They're just not a path towards human-level AI. They will be probably a component of ultimate systems. Like if you want an AI system, perhaps built along the lines of what I'm talking about, and you want it to generate, coherent language and text, you might need to use an LLM to translate the abstract thoughts of that system into text. So LLMs are going to be useful, there's no question. They're just not a path to human-level intelligence.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, in the beginning of your talk, you painted a very optimistic future, painting the world like many of the political leaders, they are surrounded by a bunch of smart people who help them. And you envisage an optimistic future where we as humans will have a bunch of smart AI agents working for us. But the reality is a lot of people are terrified of the future. They think that there'll be no jobs for us, we will be redundant, and in fact, as professors, many of us are approached by parents who said, "What should my child study? There'll be no jobs left in the world." Are you a pessimist or optimist about the labor market implications of AI?
So, I'm optimistic about the future, but it's based on some level of evidence from, not just from sort of my model of how things happen, but also talking to economists. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to answer the last question first, which is, what should young people study?
Yeah.
And my recommendation for this has not changed much, which is learn things that have a long shelf life, because it's almost certain that you're going to, the technology is going to evolve really fast, and you're going to have to change job, and you have to, basically, you need to be able to learn new things quickly. And so learn things that are like basic methods that have a long shelf life. So if you are, let's say, an undergraduate student, and you have the choice between, taking a course on mobile app programming, or I don't know, something like that, or database management or whatever, and quantum mechanics, take quantum mechanics. Because the underlying methods you're going to learn there have some likelihood of being useful, and the way they train you to think in particular ways are going to be useful, whereas the particular way in which you program mobile apps is going to disappear within 5 years. So again, take things that have a long shelf life, deep technical knowledge, because you might become the boss of a bunch of AI systems that will work for you, but you're going to have a big advantage if you have deep technical understanding of what goes on. So learn to think. Don't learn things that have a short shelf life. Okay, now the other question about, is the labor market going to be disrupted? It's going to change. Like every profession is going to be affected, including professors.
Yes.
There's no question about that. But what economists are telling us, they're telling us a bunch of stuff. And there are economists who spend their career analyzing the effect of technological revolution on the labor market, right? It's their specialty. Like that's what they publish on. So people like Philippe Aghion in France, Eric Brynjolfsson, who was a former student of Philippe Aghion, who is at Stanford, and Darren Acemoglu, who is a Nobel Prize winner from this year in economics. And what they pretty much all say, maybe Darren is a little more pessimistic, but they all say, we're not going to, Eric in particular says, we're not going to run out of jobs because we're not going to run out of problems to solve. And the nature of the job is going to change, but the speed at which a technology penetrates in the economy is limited by how fast people learn to use it. So what Eric Brynjolfsson says, for example, is that the measurable effect of a technological revolution on productivity takes typically 15 years. It takes a long time. I don't know when you start the clock about AI, probably not 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. And so we're not going to see an effect on productivity for a while. And the predicted effect on productivity are not that we're going to have a singularity and all of us will be on vacation on the beach while the robots are working for us. The prediction from people like Philippe Aghion and Eric Brynjolfsson is that the increased growth of GDP, GDP growth in most countries is around 2% if you're lucky, right? It's bigger in developing countries. The increment of growth due to AI is going to be on the order of 0.7%. Now, that's actually big because it gets compounded every year, okay? But it's not like we're going to have to, we're going to be fired and out of our job in 5 years because of AGI. That's not going to happen.
Thank you. I think that's very inspiring. So I actually have many questions to ask, but I know that a lot of people in the audience want to ask. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and there are microphones on the side. So we'll start with here.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Yong Ren. I'm an ex-NUS alumni. I work in finance. Can I know whether you think the existing AI technology and some of the new models that you propose would kind of like change the world people trade in the world? Thanks.
Possibly. I mean, a big characteristic of, obviously in finance, what you need to do is prediction. if you can predict, right, you can choose, like, how to invest and everything. But the main characteristic of a market is that it's extremely stochastic. That's kind of the essence of it. If it wasn't stochastic, it means it would be very inefficient. So there's a huge amount of noise. And so those JEPA systems are designed to eliminate the noise, basically, right? So you can imagine that the encoder gets rid of the stuff that you cannot predict. And so you make predictions at an abstract level. You can predict all the details, but those systems are more robust to noise. So there is some hope. But I can't tell you that we have results on this.
Okay, I think we'll take the next question there, and then we'll come back here.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your fantastic talk. I'm Jian Xin. I'm a PhD student working on robotics in NUS. So my question is regarding to the model learning in robotics. So in robotics, we find that sometimes visual perception cannot provide enough feedback for robot execution. Force feedback, tactile feedback can also be very important. For example, just now, when you take a photo with your glasses, you don't have to take off your glasses to find the button. Instead you just use your fingertip, get a tactile feedback to get the button pressed, right? So most of the papers you mentioned just now, I think they learn word model purely from video. Do you think we can learn good enough word model purely from video for robotics? If not, do you think there's a scalable approach to collect multimodal data for robotics to learn word model? Or maybe there are effective ways to incorporate multimodal data for
So yeah, I think the question is
yeah.
clear. Yeah.
There's no question that multimodality is necessary. Particularly in robotics, I mean, you can't do action completely open loop. You need sensory inputs beyond vision. You need touch. Like, there are people, at least there is one person in history who was both blind and deaf, and she was still kind of reasonably smart, but she had touch. So touch is almost as high bandwidth as vision. We have a very large number of touch sensors. And of course, it's an active sensing modality, right? It's not something you just receive information from. But touch is super important. It's not developed enough in the context of robotics. So in fact, we have an entire team at FAIR that works on it's not a product, but it's actually distributed to researchers called Digit 360, and it's essentially a touch sensor. I don't know if you've run into it, but yeah, we think it's a really important thing. I mean, one hope that we're having is that this JEPA approach will allow to basically integrate different modalities in a common representation space within which we can make predictions. So that's a big thing we're thinking of. And by the way, I should tell you, robotics is a big area of expansion at Meta. We're expanding research in AI, what we call embodied AI, okay? And we're also actually setting up a product group to build robots. This is the first time that Meta is actually diversifying from just connecting people with each other. Okay, so it's pretty big change.
Okay, that's exciting. We'll go to the question here, and then there.
Okay, thank you very much. So, hello Yann, I'm a huge fan of you. I'm an undergraduate student, year 3, currently studying at NTU. So, I know you're not a huge fan of LLM, but many people in the industry, as well as some in academia, said that the advancement of LLM will also push research in AI. So some people are talking about automated AI research agent at some point, maybe 2030, and so on. To what extent do you think LLM will, accelerate research in AI, such that maybe LLM can help us, automated LLM research can help us, reach human-level AI that you've mentioned?
So I think there's no question there's going to be some progress along those lines of systems that are perhaps based on LLMs with augmentation from other approaches that will help scientists in various domains. But what we are seeing though is that most of the types of models that are used in science, the AI-based models that are used in science, are not LLMs. So AlphaFold is not an LLM. ESMFold, which is a group that used to be at Meta that also works on protein structure, It's not LLMs. They use transformers, they use self-supervised learning, they use sequential prediction and all that stuff, but in the end, it's not an LLM. It's a system that is specifically designed to predict the conformation of proteins. Similarly for a lot of tasks in microscopy and medical imaging, etc., those are not LLMs at all. They're completely different approaches. If you want like an automated scientist, I mean, science is an activity that's probably going to come last in the kind of stuff that we can do with AI. So maybe building AI scientists that are completely autonomous may be a little premature. But whether it's going to come in 2030 or something else, I'm not sure. But in the end, I'm almost certain that there will not be LLMs. There will probably be things that are more like what I described, that are capable of elaborating representation levels for phenomena that are observed, and then come up with models in those representation levels. That, as I said, that's a very fundamental thing that people do in science, is finding good representations of the phenomena. And so I don't think LLMs have a particularly important role to play there, except at the corners of like helping you write papers and figuring out the good references and stuff like that, which of course it's very useful, but ultimately, I don't think that's the model. It makes people realize, though, how powerful AI could be, and so it's motivating a lot of governments and industry to invest a lot of money, so it's helping the progress of AI in that way.
Yeah, thank you. I think there was a question here.
Yeah. Hi, Professor Yann. So I'm Yunfan Li from Alpha Intelligence Capital, venture capital that you sit in the advisory board. So my question is, from a venture capital's perspective, we are looking to some interesting companies that features the robotic foundation model that looks into the energy-based models. So what do you think is the time to market for these companies, and will robotics be the most recent use case, or will something else like itinerary planning be face marking most soon?
That's an interesting question. I have to tell you, first of all, that historically, I've been overly pessimistic about the ability of companies to actually roll out products based on ideas that came out of me. So for example, the ability to do face recognition with deep learning, I didn't think was possible at the time that actually it became possible. I realized when I joined Facebook at the time that there was a group working on face recognition that used convolutional net, and it was working amazingly well. And I was amazed how well it worked. And it became practical within a year. It actually completely jump-started the whole industry, actually. Since then, actually, Facebook turned that off because there's too many issues with it. But and it's been the case for other examples where I thought the technological transfer from research papers and prototypes to product was harder than it actually was. It went faster. So my estimate, before having kind of practical system in robotics that do planning and everything that turn into products, would be like 5 years maybe, if we're lucky, 3 years. But possibly longer if we hit a snag. And there is a lot of research issues to solve there that are probably not well done in a startup, that need to be kind of done at the sort of research level, academia or labs like FAIR. So there's a big uncertainty. But what I've learned also is that in the context of startups, it's much better to be too early than to be too late.
Okay, I think we had a question up there.
So I'm Jun Lo, working for Huawei and based in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada.
I don't know where you are.
Here, yeah.
Hi.
Thank you very much, yeah. And when you advise us against a bunch of things that we should not work on, you seem to make a partial exception for reinforcement learning, right? And now I have certainly read both your path to AMI and also the Alberta plan, okay, for AI research. Now, they strike me as very similar, right?
So, can you please quickly come to the question?
Yes,
that many people
I cannot help understand your plan according to model-based RL. Okay, are you actually doing model-based reinforcement learning? Why or why not? And also maybe second part very quickly, I would love to have hopefully, you maybe at some point having a direct dialogue with Professor Richard Sutton on the similarity and differences. I hope we will be open to that. Thank you.
So, I mean, Rich Sutton and I have been, have known each other for decades. He was actually a colleague at AT&T back in the late 90s. And, I knew about his work when I was an undergrad in the 1980s, right? So, I mean, I'm very well aware of what's going on. He actually has some sort of good instinct. He's been talking about this idea of prediction. In his case, it was, there's like the DINA architecture that he was talking about a long time ago, which, is model-based and very much has some commonalities with what I was talking about. But the idea somehow that everything can be learned through, unknown objective functions, in the sense that the only way to know an objective function is to try an action and see the result. I think that idea is just not a good way of driving AI research. And a good empirical evidence for this is that this was the plan that DeepMind was built around. Right? DeepMind 12 years ago, maybe not 12, but after a few years of being in existence, they basically built the entire strategy around reinforcement learning. And it was successful in the context of games, but basically not beyond that. Okay. And for games, of course, it works because you can have millions of copies of your agent playing, playing games against itself. So there, you don't care that the sample efficiency is bad. But in the real world, it's just completely impractical. So the entire thing, there was a paper published, co-authored by Rich, first author being David Silver, and Don Apricap, and a couple other people. And the title was "Reward is Enough." I completely, 100% disagree with that paper. Completely, okay? Because I don't think that's the case. I think, and so I came up with an analogy actually before that paper, which is the cake. Maybe some of you have seen this, right? So it's the idea that the analogy that if intelligence is a cake, most of the knowledge that we acquire is through self-supervised learning. So the bulk of the cake, the genoise of the cake, if you want, it's got to be self-supervised learning. Supervised learning, in humans at least, is very minor. It comes on top of it, and that would be the icing on the cake. And reinforcement learning is the last thing you do when you do an action and you see it doesn't work and you adjust it. That's a cherry on the cake. All right. So again, I think if you are focusing, and I know you come from Alberta, it's practically a religion there. So, it's a wonderful area of research. There's a lot of really cool stuff that came out of this area of research. I have a lot of friends working on it. There's nothing wrong with that. But the idea that somehow you're going to be able to reach human-level intelligence by just basically making RL just a little more efficient than it is false.
Okay, great. We have time for 2 more questions, one here and one there.
Hi, I'm Yann from the banking and finance industry. So actually I got 2 questions. So the first question is, so we are actually kind of researching on the Meta Llama 3 model. So there are actually a lot of public comments, and according to our research experimentation results, Llama model tends to hallucinate more often compared to the other LLM models like Anthropic Cloud and also GPT model. Actually, what's your take on this, and how do you and your research team respond on this issue?
Okay, so first of all, I have to tell you, I'm not involved in Llama. Okay? Llama is in the hands of the Gen AI organization, which is development and product. At FAIR, we're working on research, long-term research, so it's the next generation AI system, perhaps along the lines of what I'm talking about, but not just that. And we're actually not that involved in Llama. We of course contribute some techniques to it, but and the whole Llama idea came out of FAIR. So the first Llama was actually produced by a small team of 12 or 13 people at FAIR Paris. And there were several teams within FAIR working on LLMs, and theirs was the most at the most combination of performance and speed. And so this was kind of picked as kind of the thing we were going to develop. And then a whole organization was built, a product organization was created to pick that up and turn it into a product. But at that point, FAIR became, a upstream contributor, but not a direct contributor to Llama. So that's the first point. Now, all of those performance, are trade-offs, right? So some of the systems you talked about, they're way more expensive in terms of inference than Llama is. And it depends which Llama we're talking about, right? Because there's multiple versions, the multiple sizes. They are also more kind of fine-tuned with user data for various tasks that are common for people. And so Llama is not a product like Claude, it's a foundation model on top of which you can build products. And if you fine-tune those systems appropriately for your vertical application, you're going to reduce the hallucination, right? So it's like, let's imagine another product area. Let's say you're building a Wi-Fi router. That's your product. The underlying technology is Linux with all the software stack for, network communication on top of it. But you're going to have to do some work to kind of turn the Linux platform and all the stuff that run on Linux into a practical Wi-Fi router with all the security and all that stuff, right? So Llama is like Linux, okay? It's a foundation, it's an infrastructure, but it's not a product. You need to build your product on top of it. And in fact, that's what open source enables. It allows you to, fine-tune the system for your vertical application any way you want, and then run it on premise and run it for cheap.
Thank you. The last question from here.
Sorry,
there's only one question per person. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk, Dr. Yann, Professor Yann. Yeah, I'm from a data trading company, own and operate listed on NASDAQ. We are currently investing and building out data startups, right? So I think my question is this. So from a data angle, the Japan model, what are your thoughts on synthetic video data or raw unstructured data, which is better for training the model itself? And if it's like raw unstructured data, do you prefer like data from startups like Calliope Network, which kind of like just like I think that slice and dice YouTube videos and just feed it into the model, or do you prefer like real world computer vision model that are retrofitted in factories and ports and warehouses and stuff like that? Yeah. And your thoughts on data diversity?
Right. I mean, you need data diversity for sure. I'm not going to claim this is a solved problem, and people have figured out what is the right set of training data for training a video model. There's quite a bit of work involved in this video JEPA example that I talked about. Video JEPA version 2 is coming out soon, and there was a lot more work on like which data to use to train it. So you need diversity. You need videos where something happens. Most YouTube video, not much happens. And you need a combination of videos that are, I mean, you need natural videos, of course, but you need a combination of things where, objects move dynamically, a combination of things where the camera is fixed or there's camera motion. You need different environments, whether they are like sort of, natural everyday video, or they could be like microscopic images or nature video, or like, simulated physical systems, or like videos of mechanical widgets, kind of doing their thing. So I mean, you need a lot of diversity. You probably need some synthetic video. So for example, children like cartoons, animated cartoons. And the reason is because in animated cartoons, all the information about the real world that is unnecessary for the point that the video tries to teach you about is not present. Okay, so you watch those educational videos where, they're trying to teach young children about numbers or about letters or about, various things on, how interactions with people work in the world. It's very schematic, it's very kind of simplified so that you pay attention to the thing the phenomenon that's relevant. So for example, could we train a system to learn very basic things about the world from like a top-down view role-playing game, right? And you can learn a lot of things from that. You just observe characters moving around from one room to another, and quickly you learn that you cannot jump from one room to a distant one. You have to actually, the trajectories of people are continuous, mostly. You can learn that a person or an object cannot be in two places at the same time. You learn that it cannot just disappear. You learn that it cannot just appear, except if you are Gandalf. And you know, you learn a lot of things like this, that, you know, that to open a door you need a key or something, right? So, you know, all of those really, really basic things about the you know, basic reality, you can learn from relatively synthetic situations. So I imagine that those will play an important role.
No, thank you. So I'll ask you one last question. So in one of your earlier slides, you were advocating for open source and saying that the world should not depend on models coming out from just US or China. So in your opinion, what do other countries like Singapore have a role to play in the future of AI innovations?
Okay, I'm really glad you're asking this question, because that's one of my favorite ones outside of research questions. So, you know, I think, as I said at the beginning of my talk, there's a future in which all of our interactions with the digital world will be mediated by AI assistants. And we cannot afford, as a society, and humanity more generally, we cannot afford the fact that this information will be filtered by just a handful of AI assistants coming from 2 or 3 companies on the west coast of the US or China. Because we need systems that speak all the languages in the world. There's about 6,000 languages spoken in the world, something like that, most of which are not written. There's a lot of cultural diversity. Most of the cultural information, if you want, is not actually available digitally. There's a lot of culture that is just not there, right? And it cannot be translated into text necessarily. You know, it can be recordings of traditional music. It could be, you know, pictures of traditional dress or dances or practices or whatever, or, you know, how various populations build particular artifacts. All of that is expertise that is lost unless you preserve it. So we need AI systems to kind of learn about all those things. And it's not doable by any single entity, you know, be it a big company like a big tech company on the west coast of the US or a big Chinese tech company. So what that means is that if we want AI systems to speak all the languages in the world, understand all the cultures, understand all the value systems, have all the possible biases in terms of philosophy of life, politics, religion, whatever you want, it's not going to come from a small number of AI assistants. It's going to have to come from a wide diversity of AI assistants. And the problem with this is that building basic foundation models is very expensive, and that can only be done by a few entities right now. So the best way to proceed is that for some of those entities in the US, in China, perhaps in Europe, to provide open source foundation models on top of which anyone can build whatever assistant they want that speaks their language, understands their culture, and whatever. I actually think that in the future, those foundation models will be seen as common infrastructure and will actually be trained collaboratively with a lot of players around the world. And so that's maybe some place where Singapore can have an important role, which could be kind of a nexus in Asia of, in the Far East at least, of a center where you have, let's say, computing infrastructure and the competence from this university and NTU and perhaps a few others to contribute to training sort of a worldwide foundation model. Okay, so what's needed for this? What's needed is expertise, a big GPU data center, and data that nobody else has, okay, which you can get. It's a small country, so you probably don't have a huge amount of data, but you can help your neighbors gathering that data, like Indonesia or Malaysia or you know, other countries in the region, so that the next generation of foundation model will basically speak all the languages. Just in Indonesia, there's like 300 of them or something, right? So So that's, I think, is an important thing. So I think there's going to be some sort of consortium in the future. I'm not talking about a meta company policy here. I'm talking about, like, predicting what I think would be a good thing. Would be some sort of worldwide partnership with companies like Meta and perhaps Mistral and perhaps DeepSeek and perhaps others in China, contributing to training a global foundation model that speaks all the languages in the world, understands all the cultures, on top of which anyone could build actual products. And if you think about this, this would be repeating the history of what happened with the software the software infrastructure of the internet. It's all based on open source right now. The entire internet runs on open source. It didn't start out that way. There were 3 major players that were competing to provide the hardware and software infrastructure of the internet in the 90s. Companies like Sun Microsystems, like Microsoft, like Hewlett-Packard, Dell. They're all providing their own computer, their own operating system, their own stack. All of this was completely wiped out by commodity hardware and Linux. Okay, it's going to be the same thing for AI. So whether open source is going to win in the context of AI is only a matter of time.
Okay, on that note, thank you once again for a contrarian but a very exciting lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. LeCun and Prof. Mohan. May we invite you to remain on stage as we'd like to take a group photo with the audience. Thank you, Prof. LeCun and Prof. Mohan. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of this morning's session, which we hope has been interesting and insightful. Do check out the video recording of this event, made available right now on NUS Cast. Thank you, and we wish you a pleasant weekend ahead.